Welcome to This Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today because honestly, we are embarking on a truly fascinating journey. If you've been following Dr. Avinash Kumar Gupta's groundbreaking course, Clinical Cognition, from First Principles, you're probably pretty familiar with this standard 13-lesson core. And those lessons are incredible, right? They brilliantly map out how clinical reasoning actually moves in real time rather than just the final conclusion it reaches. But today, today we are not looking at the core. We're venturing way past that main sequence to discover the specialized power-ups hidden right there in the appendices. We're going to unpack the elective modules, basically a specialized toolkit designed for anyone who wants to push their clinical reasoning to the absolute limits. So get comfortable and let's unlock these advanced cognitive tools together.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. 1, beyond the main sequence. 2, the micro with N of 1 research. 3, the macro, exploring community medicine. 4, synthesizing the evidence. 5, longitudinal cross-case learning. And finally, 6, the final calibration. Let's dive right in.
Section 1, beyond the main sequence, unlocking the electives.
So what actually happens when we step out of the familiar, safe territory of the core curriculum? Well, we find a pretty stark contrast. Over on the left, we've got the main sequence. These are your 13 core lessons. The first 9 build what Dr. Gupta calls the core cognitive engine. So things like observation, bias auditing, building the differential. And then the last 4 extend into systems thinking and true mastery. That right there is the engine that drives your daily clinical thought. But look on the right side. We have the electives. These are 5 optional, much shorter modules intentionally kept completely out of the main sequence. Why? Because while the core builds your everyday engine, these electives act as a specialist's toolbelt. They're these specific, highly targeted instruments for clinicians and techies alike who stumble upon wild edge cases, or who just require a highly specialized lens that the standard course simply doesn't cover. And here is that exact toolbelt laid out for you. The 5 electives straight from the 5 rounds prompt library are Module M9 for N of 1 research, M10 for journal reading, M19 for community medicine, M25 for thematic analysis, and M7 for longitudinal cross-case learning. Now, don't get it twisted. These aren't just extra reading assignments you can skip over. They're cognitive power tools. You pull these out when you hit a baffling edge case that the standard guidelines just completely whiffed on. These specific modules are designed to prompt and push your reasoning to the absolute cutting edge, addressing situations that demand a completely different scale or method of thought. Section 2, the micro, N of 1 research. Zooming all the way in. To really grasp how radically different these tools are, we've got to zoom all the way in. Think about a massive, fundamental problem in standard medical practice. What happens when the broad population data just doesn't fit the unique, highly complex patient sitting right in front of you? This is exactly where Module M9 steps up to the plate. N of 1 research is defined as single-subject clinical trials that focus entirely on hyper-individualized patient data. It pushes your clinical reasoning down to the ultimate micro level. Instead of asking, hey, what works for the average person? It asks, is this specific wearable data showing real improvement for this one single patient today? If you're at all interested in the frontier of precision medicine, I'm telling you, this elective is an absolute game changer. It shifts your entire baseline of evidence to an audience of exactly 1. Which brings us to Section 3, the macro, community medicine. Time to zoom out to the population. But hey, the whole point of a specialist's toolbelt is versatility, right? So from the hyper-individual, we pivot dramatically to the grand population scale. On one hand, you have Module M9, hyper-fixated on personal data. But right next to it in your toolbelt is Module M19, community medicine, where the focus violently shifts to macro-scale health trends. How do environmental factors, systemic barriers, and broad demographic shifts completely rewrite the cognitive landscape? This contrast shows us how beautifully these modules force our cognitive tools to adapt. I mean, you literally cannot use the exact same reasoning trace to solve a single patient's mysterious symptom as you would to manage a neighborhood-wide viral outbreak. The scale dictates the strategy, and this tool belt gives you the power to handle both extremes. Moving on to Section 4, synthesizing the evidence, making sense of the data. Now, whether you're looking at a single patient or 1,000 of them, managing clinical cognition ultimately boils down to effectively processing a massive avalanche of external information. We have a simple 2-step flow here that completely transforms how a practitioner interacts with medical literature. Step 1 leans on Module M10, journal reading. And this isn't just idly skimming a PDF over coffee, it's a heavily structured cognitive approach to consuming an article, understanding its constraints and ruthlessly evaluating its core claims. But then we level up to step 2, Module M25, Semantic Analysis. This is where the magic happens, and you extract patterns across multiple sources. You stop being a passive reader who just kind of nods along to the conclusion of a single journal, and you become an active, predatory extractor of thematic evidence. You're synthesizing. You are taking raw text and forging it into actionable, pattern-based clinical reasoning. Section 5. Longitudinal cross-case learning. Learning over time. So if you're pulling patterns from literature, you also really need to be extracting patterns from your own lived experience, right? That is what Module M7 is all about, connecting the dots across multiple patient presentations over time. And I gotta say, I absolutely love this concept. It directly answers the question, how does your learning actually compound in the real world? When you see a super subtle presentation on a random Tuesday, and then a weirdly similar one 3 months later, how exactly does your cognitive engine link those two events? Module M7 completes our specialized toolbelt by ensuring your reasoning isn't just static, it evolves, it adapts, and it learns across incredibly long timelines, turning isolated, one-off clinical encounters into a cohesive, massively growing body of personal expertise. And finally, Section 6, the final calibration, tying it all back to evidence-based medicine. All right, so we've explored the 5 electives, we have our tool belts securely strapped on, but how does this entire clinical cognition framework, from the core main sequence all the way out to these wild electives, situate itself in the messy real world? Well, it brings us face to face with a massive foundational question. Can I trust this evidence? This is the exact core question that drives a sibling course in the Vibrons library titled Evidence-Based Medicine from First Principles. And it's a critical question, maybe the most critical in all of modern medicine. But on its own, it's only half the equation. See, evidence-based medicine asks, can I trust this evidence? But clinical cognition fires back with an equally vital question. How did I get from findings to a judgment in the first place? The absolute crucial takeaway here is that these two concepts are completely complementary. They are not sequential. You can honestly start your learning journey with either one. However, the sheer brilliance of the curriculum is that you really need the internal cognition mechanics, your bias auditing, your differential building, your N of 1 or thematic analysis to properly evaluate and apply the external evidence that EBM provides. They act as mirror images of clinical excellence. And I want to leave you today with this final, genuinely striking quote straight from the course materials. All outputs require independent clinical verification. It's a powerful disclaimer for sure, but it's also a deeply profound philosophical statement. We can use the 13 core modules to build an incredible high-revving cognitive engine. We can use the 5 elective modules to strap on a high-powered specialist's tool belt, forcing the invisible trace of clinical reasoning completely out in the open. But at the end of the day, all these tools, all these complex modules, all these prompts, they only serve to sharpen the mind of the practitioner. Human judgment, with all its heavy responsibility and nuance, remains the ultimate failsafe. It kind of leaves you wondering, doesn't it? As our tools get sharper and sharper, how much sharper must our own independent judgment become? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped you see the incredible architecture hiding behind clinical cognition.